Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and coach. You're on the Steady Coach. Welcome back to another success story. This one coming to you from Alex, who's here to share his story of recovery from MdDS, or Mal de Débarquement Syndrome. This story is very important to me to share because MdDS gets a particularly awful reputation both on the internet and off the internet, and many people with MdDS are told A, that they may never recover, and B, that they particularly may never recover if their symptoms have gone on longer than a year. Both of those statements are false, and this story is going to show you that. Alex's symptoms started in mid-2022. We recorded this story at the beginning of 2025. His symptoms have come down from basically being at about a 7 to 10 on the symptom intensity scale to a 0 to 1. He's still actually in the process of recovery as we recorded this interview, but has been feeling so very much better, almost recovered, that he wanted to share his story now. Alex is a very insightful person, and he's also a musician who is going to be documenting some of the things that he's gone through in this journey through music. So please be sure to check the video description and the podcast description for links to his social media and website, and he'll be updating them when he releases this new music. All right, enjoy this interview, and as always, please be sure to give us a like, a subscribe if you're on YouTube, leave your questions and comments below. If you're listening to this as a podcast, you can also give the podcast a follow and leave us a 5-star rating. These things really help me reach more people, and that is my mission. Alex, welcome. So glad to have you here. It is truly an honor. I just can't wait to hear your whole story because I know even just some of it, and there are some details to your story that I think people have never heard before in any of the success stories. It's really inspirational. And again, just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Alex, let's just get rolling right away. Tell me just a little bit about yourself so that people have some context as we head into the story of your neural circuit dizziness story.
Sure. So I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I am the son of 2 lawyers who met at the State Department, and I grew up in a house full of education and music, and I had a great childhood that, most people would kill for. I have a younger brother who's a doctor. He's a psychiatrist. And I now currently live in LA. I went to USC to study business and classical piano. And I currently live in LA with my fiance, and and in between then and now, a lot happened, and I'm happy to dive into that in terms of how I ended up on my chronic dizziness journey.
Alex, I should have actually asked you this off air, but I'm glad you brought that up. We're recording this right around the time of the LA fires. So how are you doing with all of this going on? Are you anywhere near the affected areas?
Yeah, I live about 10 or 15 minutes from the Altadena fire, and we are okay. I mean, the worst that we personally endured was the smoke a few days, probably like Wednesday or Thursday of the week that it was at its worst. It felt like Dune. Like you go outside and the sky is orange and very smoky. Yeah. But we have friends and some people in our lives that were drastically affected. And I know that they could use all the help that they can get in terms of resources and energy and healing vibes and all of that stuff. So we were super fortunate to be okay, but we know people who are not, and we're sending all of our love to them.
Yes. From all of us as well. Let's go to kind of the beginning of this dizziness specific story. So how did everything get started for you?
So the first symptom that I really experienced in this weird journey that I've been on was in France. I was on a tour. I was actually on 2 months worth of music tours back to back. And it ended when we were in Europe. So my fiance and I decided to extend our trip and do a vacation. So we were walking.
And this was when? What
This
year?
was July of 2022.
Okay, got it.
So we were on the boardwalk in Nice and having a great time. And all of a sudden I felt kind of a pop in my ear. And it felt like a little rip or a tear almost. And then it kind of felt like a balloon was just inside of my head. And that was the first symptom on this weird streak that it would obviously get a lot worse. But that was the first thing. And that first night, I actually went to urgent care. I'm lucky enough to speak French, but I'm like 80 to 90% fluent, not native speaker. So, going to this urgent care appointment with a doctor who doesn't speak English, I was able to translate as much as I could. And she gave me antibiotics, and she also gave me a steroid to make sure that she could treat it, whether it was bacterial or viral. But as we know now, probably it wasn't either of those things. It was probably just psychophysiological. So moving forward a few days, we ended up in the Amalfi Coast. And my fiance and I went on a boat trip from LA to, or not from LA, pardon me, from Sorrento to Positano. And it was so choppy. It was, I've never done well with motion sickness, and I was not equipped for how bumpy it was going to be. So I was kind of terrified a lot of the trip. And I'm sure that that also like enhanced and increased the symptoms that would later present themselves. So it wasn't really till that night. We took the ferry there, we spent the day there, and then we took the ferry back. And both of the rides were extremely choppy. So I didn't feel any symptoms until that night, but I was about to go to bed, and I remember like getting into bed, and it felt like the bed was moving up like 8 to 10 feet in the air. It was really dramatic.
Yeah.
And that was obviously difficult, but it would only continue to get more difficult after that. So the following day, my fiance and I went to Pompeii. We were walking around the ruins there. I dreamed to go there since I was a kid. And it was this weird thing because when I was walking around, I experienced no symptoms at all. But then when I was standing still, I was feeling this like really strong up and down pull. So later that night, we fly to Milan, where our flight was going to take us back to the United States. So we fly to Milan. Obviously, on the flight, I'm in motion, don't feel any symptoms. I don't know anything about MdDS diagnosis or any of that stuff, but I get off the flight, and then I start to feel up and down sensation. And then the flight from Milan to Dallas. Actually, sorry, it was Frankfurt. It was Frankfurt to Dallas, and I remember flying from there. And when we landed, I felt normal. I stood up, and then as soon as I started taking a few steps, my life completely changed. I felt like it was the only day of my journey that I felt true vertigo symptoms of like spinning around. The world was feeling like it was an ocean. I was like on the verge of vomiting. I ended up going to the bathroom, and I was dry heaving. And I was like, I felt like I had zero control over anything. I was terrified. I was just so at a loss for words. And I really was just in a total fight or flight. What the hell is happening? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously you'd never experienced anything like this before. So what's your first thought here? Is it like I'm I must have a brain tumor, or like I'm having a heart attack? Like what are you starting to think is happening?
Well, one thing that was common for me prior to this, even though I'd never experienced this sensation before, was being prone to catastrophizing.
Okay.
So as a pianist, I play piano for a living, and I have a benign tumor on my finger right here. And I didn't know what it was for a long time, but it was this bump that it would cause like impingements. And anytime that and sometimes it would be like a day or two that would really hurt. And as soon as something like that would happen, my mind jumps to worst case scenario.
Mhm.
So that being one of my character traits, something like this is not great because immediately my mind was going to, I'm damaged or I'm broken or something's really wrong. And I wasn't equipped to handle the nature of the severity of the symptoms, and certainly if I knew then what I know now in terms of how long it's taken me to recover, my mindset would have been even worse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Okay. So you head home and do you immediately start running to doctors?
Pretty immediately, yeah. So we land in Dallas and then we have another flight to LA, and obviously that flight is, afterwards I'm freaking out. I'm in a really bad space. We the next day, my heart rate is just through the roof, and I go to the hospital and I go to ER, and a doctor there says, "Oh, I've also dealt with dizziness. I think what you're dealing with is just you need to go find a chiropractor and do the Epley maneuver because we
Oh,
think
okay.
that you have BPPV." And that's my first experience into doctors thinking that they know what I have when they don't. And for the record, in this, in this conversation that we have, I'm not going to directly try to throw any doctors under the bus for whatever diagnoses they've given me or whatever they thought was in my best interest. In terms of that stuff, I did deal with doctors who, in my opinion, did a genuinely bad job. But in general, when it comes to doctors having a blind spot, when it comes to mind body dizziness, I'm not going to like spend the whole time criticizing them or anything.
Right.
This is a very unknown space, certainly to me and certainly to a lot of people and practitioners. So that's not my intent. But to go back to the hospital experience, the doctor says, "Well, I think you have BPPV. So just find a chiropractor who can do the Epley maneuver. I'm going to give you some, I think it was meclizine. And I forget what the patch that you put on the back of your ear is called. Uh,
Yeah, yes, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I don't want to say the wrong name and then have people go out and ask for the wrong thing. So
yeah,
yes, but yes, there are patches that you could get for motion sickness or for
yeah.
seasickness. Yes.
So initially the working diagnosis was maybe BPPV, but I
Okay.
remember very distinctly when the symptoms first started. I obviously, as an overthinking person, my first route was going to Google and seeing what my symptoms might be. And I do remember the first day of my symptoms, maybe that day that I went to the hospital, seeing Mal de Débarquement Syndrome as one of the
Mhm.
diagnoses. So in the back of my mind, I guess I always knew that that could be an option, but seeing things that were written up there, like if this is, if you have this for more than a year, then you're probably going to deal with it for the rest of your life. Those things freaked me out.
Of
So I
course.
didn't want to believe that that was what it might be. So the first few weeks I kind of spend in freak out mode, in trying to diagnose myself, really, because I'm not sure if the doctor is right. I don't necessarily think the doctor is wrong, but it doesn't seem to line up with the other symptoms of BPPV, don't just seem to add up for
Yeah.
me. The room isn't spinning, it just feels like I'm walking on unstable ground. So I go to a chiropractor, they do the Epley maneuver on me. It makes it worse. My
Oh,
symptoms increase. It, feels like I have a migraine, kind of just like increasing my headaches. And finally, after a few weeks, I actually went to an ENT in between. And uh, accompanying my dizziness were symptoms like TMJ, ear clogging,
mhm.
tinnitus, those kinds of things, neck pain, neck tightness, that kind of stuff. So when I go to the ENT, I tell him I'm experiencing this dizziness. I'm also experiencing TMJ and inner ear tightness and tinnitus and all that stuff. And he looked in my ear and he said, "Well, nothing's wrong. I mean, I'm not seeing anything that's wrong. So why don't we just send you to a neurologist, and we'll also send you to vestibular physical therapy."
Okay.
So again, working on this physical diagnosis, that seems to be like a decent strategy at that time. So I go to a neurologist and he says, "Well, I think based on the symptoms that you're explaining to me that you probably have Mal de Débarquement Syndrome." So that's the moment that I realized, okay, maybe me looking that up, that was, yeah, I found it. This is what I have now.
Mhm.
So I also get sent to a vestibular physical therapist, and I'm doing the whole balance retraining exercises, which, don't really do anything in terms of getting rid of my dizziness, although my balance improves. And I think overall, I actually think that was a positive experience doing several months of that because my balance in general is a lot better. And I think that, while I don't think that those treatments necessarily will always help you with your imbalance in this situation, it may help for some. And
Mhm.
it certainly just helped in terms of like lifestyle and doing yoga and those kinds of things. So,
Right.
um, so
It's my
anyway, yeah,
yeah, and honestly, even if I suspect someone has a neural circuit condition, if they've never done a round of VRT, vestibular rehab therapy, for those of you who don't know that acronym, I, I think it is the first line gold standard treatment, and people should do it. And now, for some people, they can't financially or just geographically, it's not possible, which is why I have that free version on my free course. People can also sometimes do this by telehealth, but I do recommend them. I just tell people your objective with those kinds of exercises is a little bit different than maybe the average person. It's really more about also exposing your brain to the things that it's afraid of, to teach it that the triggers aren't bad. And you if you are doing it for a really long time and it's not making a difference, then why are we still doing it? It's obviously not the right thing to do if it's not making things better. So
yeah,
I just wanted to interject that because it's you bring up a good point. It actually, I think it is helpful for people. It's not enough for a lot of people.
yeah, exactly. And I think at that time, any treatment that came up along the way that felt like it was an open door, I was enthusiastic about.
Mhm.
I definitely was really miserable, and the symptoms were really bad. And to kind of extend from chronic dizziness into some other symptoms that I ended up dealing with, about 3 weeks after the symptoms started, so like very end of July, I had a 2-day period of like acute insomnia where I didn't sleep for 2 days straight. And I was terrified, total panic. And that sort of started a very, very long, arduous period of chronic insomnia as well. So, for about like right after that, sort of late July, early August, all that kind of stuff, I had been put on Ambien for sleep. And so I was
Okay.
taking like a full dose of Ambien and still sleeping like 2 to 3 hours a night. It was really, really
Mm.
bad. And weirdly, though, simultaneously, and I think this is an important part of the story to talk about too, is that my neurologist had put me on lorazepam for anxiety, not for symptom reduction. And my symptoms started to dissipate. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just getting better. And my sleep was terrible. I was just so exhausted. I was terrified of going to bed. Like once the sun would go down, I was just like horrified, all
Mm.
that kind of stuff. But my dizziness was getting better, so at least something was getting better. And then at some point I go back for another visit with my neurologist, and he says, you shouldn't be on lorazepam. Lorazepam is bad for you. You shouldn't be taking it. Now, of course, my initial thought is, well, you're the one who prescribed it for me to take. So what, if it's so
Yes.
bad of a medication to take, why are you telling me that I should get off of it? So anyway, he instructs me to sort of wean off in a way that seemed normal at the time. But in retrospect, I'm pretty certain, and I don't want to say with 100% certainty, but I weaned off of it too quickly. And I started to,
Oh wow,
not only
I'm
did
so
my
sorry.
dizziness start again, in a, obviously going back to the way that it was before, but I dealt with about 2 months straight of chronic migraine. And so
Oh, for
it
goodness
was,
sake.
yeah.
Oh,
So I remember I was visiting my fiance's parents, and I remember I walked around the house, and literally my feet were like barely lifting off the ground, and every step I took felt like someone was stabbing me in the head. And it was that in terms of like dealing with chronic insomnia and dealing with migraines, which I would deal with then for the next 2 months, and all that stuff, that was certainly my low point in
yeah.
terms of lifestyle symptoms, overwhelm, and the peak of my anxiety and depression throughout this period of time.
Yeah. Okay. So just give us a sense, since this is important for people, before we move on to the next part of your story and what you started doing next, can you give us a sense, what were the the dizziness symptoms or dizziness related symptoms like at this point? So when you're also experiencing this migraine, whether as the result of the tapering or not, and then also now the insomnia, what are the dizziness symptoms doing now?
At that point, the dizziness symptoms, like they've been through most of the time, I didn't have a way of describing it at the time, but the best way that I now know with the vocabulary that I have is trampoline floor.
Okay.
So that sensation of feeling like the ground is uneven, the ground is moving, that it feels like the floor is almost like
Yeah.
Minecraft or something where the blocks are like lower or higher.
Yeah.
And it is, as people who are listening to this who know what that sensation is like, it's extremely ungrounding, extremely anxiety inducing when you're not used to it. And even when you are used to it, it's not something that you would like to feel.
Yeah.
But but there were certain triggers, obviously, that would make my symptoms worse. In fact, a lot. So besides driving and sleeping, the symptoms were pretty much constant and at a high level. If I showered in hot water, it would make my symptoms really bad. And at that time, because we were working with physical diagnoses, I mentioned this to my doctor, and he thought I might have POTS because it might
Oh,
be like a, blood circulation issue. So again, then I'm working off a different diagnosis of like something else is wrong with me. And so I would only shower every other day because showering was so miserable that I wouldn't do it.
mhm.
And I would say, yes, the other symptoms in terms of my dizziness, um,
Especially the ones that were 24/7 because you're not walking 24/7. Did you just have that constant like up and down sensation when even when
yes,
you were still? Okay.
yes. So,
Yeah.
in different stages of where I'm at physically would be worse. So lying down was always best, then sitting up was next best, and then standing up was always the worst.
Mhm.
And so, or walking would probably be worse. I mean, kind of a tie, I guess you could say, with
Mhm.
like walking. And certainly as I was trying to both deal with the dizziness, I'm also trying to stay tired enough to sleep. So I would be trying to walk like 5 or 6 miles a day to counteract it. And I think overall that was probably good for my dealing with the dizziness too. Although at that time I didn't have somatic tracking as something that I was doing. I was just walking, and probably every step I was still hating the sensations that I had. And it's important to note that and I'll explain what happened in the middle, but for about, a year and a half, I spent most of that time just hating the symptoms. Just, I couldn't stand them. And
Of course.
they, it, I rejected this part of myself that was creating the dizziness or whatever it was, because it felt unbearable. And also because it felt, as it grew and more and more chronic, that this was just something that I was going to potentially deal
Oh
with.
my gosh. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So human though, right? So human. It it's really the most counterintuitive part of recovery, right? That we ask you to try to change that because what you just described, like who wouldn't feel that way, right? Knowing what you knew then, why would you feel any differently? Why wouldn't you just hate them and hate your body for betraying you and worry that this was your life now? So,
Yeah.
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 So, okay. So tell me about this year and a half. So you're, you're, you have this chronic migraine for 2 months. Things are just progressively getting worse, it sounds like. At some point, do you just stabilize and just kind of try to live your life around it? Like, how do you get through this time?
I think the thing that got me through this time was support from my fiance Emily, for support from my parents and from my grandparents and my brother. My brother was a huge resource during this time, being a doctor. And for the first month and a half, I called him every day, and he answered every call and made me try to feel as comforted as I could, even though he was not a balance expert. He was, he was on the psychiatry track before he graduated from med school. And so he knew he was going to do that, but he really helped me a lot. And, my parents' financial support, trying all of these extremely expensive treatments, trying to fix it. I
What
feel
did you
like,
do? What kind of treatments did you do?
when I found, once I had, once I knew what my MdDS diagnosis was, I was fully on that. So I found Dr. Cha in Minnesota,
Mhm.
and I'd reached out to her team, and I asked her, I said, I'm working with this MdDS diagnosis. I'd really like to come potentially see you in Minnesota, but are there any doctors that you would recommend in the LA area for treating this condition? And she mentioned Dr. Marissa Chang in LA, who I love, and she's wonderful. And but I don't get an appointment until January. So, and this is October. So I go to see her in January. And so I'm kind of staying optimistic, and I have this door open of like opportunity or potential treatment plans. So I go to Dr. Chang, and it really, meeting her was wonderful for a lot of reasons, because she gave me some optimism for a long time about doing treatments. Even though the treatments that we didn't help me, she made me feel really good and seen. And part of the reason that she made me feel so seen was that I explained my life story and my MdDS experience. And she said, well, I'm so glad you're here and I can relate to your experience because I too have MdDS.
Wow.
And she was the first person that I had met in 6 months or heard talk about or anything that had this condition. And I just started bawling because I felt like she could actually understand the symptoms that I was experiencing. And I told her about what I had felt and, emotions, but also physical sensations. And she totally got it. And she caught it at a very early stage of her recovery, and she did a more physical treatment for her stuff, but she is largely symptom free. And so again, I felt inspired knowing that she had done it, that I could do it myself. So we start doing a number of different things. We did some Botox injections into my neck, which didn't do anything, but again, felt like we were trying something new and that it might work. Eventually we do another injection into like this part of my neck right here in the back of my neck, with like a high dose of Botox, and that doesn't do anything either. We do TMS. So, transcranial magnetic stimulation, not to be confused with the other Dr. Sarno TMS.
Yes. Yes.
And so I remember I was on a trip to Phoenix to see my family. So at this time, also keep in mind that my neurologist kind of recommended that I not fly, just because the trigger the last time was a flight in terms of making my symptoms worse. So I drove to a wedding in Arizona. I was not comfortable flying yet, and I was sort of advised until I felt good enough to do it that I shouldn't do it. So I go to Phoenix, and I have my car, and I remember my Dr. Chang's office had said, we don't know 100% if you're going to be able to go back for this week, but maybe it'll be next week, maybe it'll be the week after. And I get a call from them saying, you're good for TMS tomorrow. So I remember just hopping in my car and just driving 6 hours back and saying like, all right, this is going to be the thing that works. I've so much faith. I know of people who've recommended this. People's testimony says that this will work. I go back to LA and I do 5 days in a row of the expedited like Stanford procedure, which is like you do, I think 4 or 5 sessions per day of tapping on your head. And, that treatment, I'm sure has worked for some people. And it's also an amazing tool potentially for depression and anxiety. And, but I basically, they said, okay, if you don't feel better, don't worry, because in a few weeks, that's when you'll know. And 2 weeks go by and I feel no different. And I'm obviously pretty upset. And so then at that point, I reach out to Dr. Cha again. I have an appointment scheduled with her for June of 2023. And it's probably March. March was when I did the TMS treatments. So I've got a few months until then. So I need something to keep me going mentally, right? And also keep in mind that at that point, I'd also reached out to Dr. Yakushin at Mount Sinai to
Yes.
schedule the procedure there. So I was going to go to see Dr. Cha in June, and then I had scheduled way ahead of time. I was very lucky to get into the Sinai clinic in July. So in that time, I need something to keep me going mentally, like need something to feel like there's some optimism to try something. And I get referred to a NUCCA chiropractor. So, NUCCA being, I think it's the upper cervical, like North
Yes.
America, upper cervical certified chiropractor.
Yes.
So it's very low touch adjustments. It's not like a very intense one. So again, Dr. Cha had seen some positive results with that. So she said that I should find a NUCCA chiropractor. And I found a wonderful NUCCA chiropractor. Again, just like a gem of a human, really nice practitioner. It didn't work for my dizziness, but she also kept me very positive. And seeing her, she was always like, it was really nice just having someone like that. So fast forward to June, and I go to Minnesota. I had flown for the first time in May, which gave me a lot of anxiety, but I was able to sort of deal with it. I took lorazepam as sort of like an anti-anxiety, also potentially as like a lowering of symptoms for that experience. So I felt I could start to get my life a little bit more normal again. So I go to Minnesota. They do these treatments. It's more like scans and sort of reads on what is going on in your head. And their theory is that I basically had like cervical dystonia, among other things. So that there was some like compression in my neck, and that there was something, again, something physically wrong with me. And that was explaining why when they did this reading. I also did a CT scan with contrast. And when I did the CT scan with contrast, it felt like this warm whoosh of liquid just like flowing through my body. And I had a really strong allergic reaction to it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I ended up being like, they put me on, some drip or whatever, like Benadryl drip or something like that. Antihistamine.
I've seen that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So then I meet with Dr. Cha. She's lovely, really kind person, and took a long time with me, talked about my condition, all of these things. And she gave me sort of a roadmap again of things to work off of. But it was all rooted in, again, MdDS, physical diagnosis, maybe PPPD, but something of that nature. Mm-hmm. So then finally, the first thing that really seems to help me in terms of a treatment was going to Sinai. Mm-hmm. So I go to New York, and I'm staying with my brother for the week. And I would basically take an Uber to the clinic every day. And I was so excited to try it. Every door that closed, there's a new one that was open. And when Minnesota, I went, it was a little bit anticlimactic only because I thought I'd go and then I'd feel fine maybe, but I didn't. So I go to New York for these treatments, and I go through the daily, kind of like spinning around, doing some like vestibular balance things. Oh, I also want to quickly backtrack 1 second that in order to qualify for the study, I had to take a VNG test, which is an incredibly unpleasant experience for anybody who has also gone through that. But the reason it's unpleasant is because my inner ear was not perforated, or there was no damage to the inner ear like veneers or anything like that. So that made me eligible to qualify for this study.
To make sure you didn't have weakness in your ears. Yeah.
Exactly.
In other words, in order to qualify, there can't be evidence that you actually have vestibular damage.
Correct.
So, which tells us that if whatever it was that set off your symptoms way back wasn't necessarily anything that was affecting your inner ear, despite you having that sensation in your ear.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So I go to Sinai, I do the treatments, and by the end of the week, I feel terrible. And I just thought, wow, I thought going here was going to make me better. And Dr. Yakushin said, well, don't judge based on how you're feeling right now. Maybe in 2 weeks, let me know how you're feeling. Mm-hmm. And for the first time in a year, at that point, it had been July 22 to July 23. For the first time in 1 year, I felt so much better. Mm-hmm. I wasn't where I'm at now. Like, my level of dizziness is so much better, but I went from like a 7 or an 8 out of 10 to like a 3 or 4 out of 10.
Yeah.
So
And can I say
yeah,
a word around what this, because people ask about like the optokinetic stripes, for example. They're the DIY version of I mean the whole treatment, which I know is not comparable, but it's kind of trying to simulate that
sure.
particular
Yeah.
treatment.
Yeah.
So people often ask me if they should try it, and I it's not that it's just placebo. Okay. So it's not, so I'm not saying there isn't an element of placebo, but you're someone who already had lots of opportunities for placebo, and this actually made a difference. So I don't think we can attribute people's success on this to placebo. What the optokinetic stripes do is basically they press Control Alt Delete on your vestibular system, the part of the vestibular system that's, we theorize anyway, stores velocity, which in other words is that part of your vestibular system, the processing centers that are predicting motion when there isn't any.
Yeah.
So that's what the optokinetic stripe exercise does. So from my perspective, and this is my biased perspective as someone who works in the mind body and neural circuit world, I think that's not fully addressing the actual root problem, which is why is the brain reacting as strongly as it is to triggers? So what's keeping that cycle of prediction errors going? But it is a way of stopping the prediction error cycle, at least on a symptom level. So it's a way of telling your brain, hey, actually, we're not moving right now, just FYI. And if someone's main source of fear and anxiety is the symptoms themselves, and of course it's a huge source of fear and anxiety for most people, but for some people, I mean, it's the thing that's really keeping symptoms going. If we temporarily stop the symptoms by doing that, that reset on the vestibular system, that can interrupt the cycle that keeps neural circuit symptoms going.
Yeah.
My issue is that, as you discovered, it's not, it doesn't need to be an either or. Physical treatments don't like that may actually do something to the vestibular system. Being able to do those things doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be addressing the things that actually keep symptoms going. And I think you're probably going to go into a little bit more of that, but I actually really wanted to say that because I think people are going to ask, and I'd also like to hear your take on what I just said.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree. I think my symptoms were the root of my fear and the greatest source of anxiety in my life still at that time. And even after I started to feel better, getting back to LA and sort of getting my life feeling a bit more normal, I hadn't reached a point yet where I really accepted the symptoms that I was experiencing.
Yeah.
Again, not liking them, but I didn't tolerate them either. Every time I experienced it, I remember just walking around, and almost every step I would take, I would feel this immediate reaction to it. And that brings me to, the next 4 months are quite a bit better. And then on Thanksgiving Day, 2023, I'm at my grandma's senior community for Thanksgiving dinner. And I remember I'm walking through the cafeteria, and it felt like the floor just fell out from underneath me.
Yeah.
And I relapsed, not back to day one levels, but back to pre-New York levels.
Right.
So
That's
yeah.
and that's exactly my point. I've seen this play out time and time again. I'm so sorry. I mean, my heart is dropping as you're telling the story too, because I can only imagine, like, you thought, oh my gosh, I'm finally getting my life back, and then boom. But like you said, now probably in hindsight, it's obvious at that time. We don't know exactly what would have happened, but I wonder how different it would have been if you had had the mindset that you have now and known how to react to what happened differently.
Oh, I mean, I think about that. I try not to live my life with regrets, but I do think often about where I would be and where I'd be if I had this mindset that I have now so much earlier. I mean, I think about that all the time.
Yeah.
So at that point, I'm obviously really defeated, thinking that this thing that had worked, obviously I wasn't healed fully, but I was a lot better and my life was so much more normal. So at that time, actually, this ties directly to your podcast, which is that when I was on that first flight in May, my first flight that I took, I downloaded a bunch of podcasts to try to like ease my anxiety while I was on the flight. And one of the podcasts that I downloaded was an episode of your show with Joella.
Oh.
And the striking part is that my anxiety on the flight was pretty fine. So I didn't actually listen to your episode until like end of November. So it was 6 months. And I think looking at the way that I went through this recovery process, I think the way that I felt throughout was like, well, if a door closes, then one opens, right? And I think maybe subconsciously I thought that because I was about to go to Minnesota, because I was about to go to New York, that those were my open doors. And the interview that you had with an MdDS patient, maybe I thought that when a door closed, that was going to be a new open door for me. And so that's why I didn't listen to it. And I never got around to end up listening to it. So Thanksgiving.
Just one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt you and just say, and look, again, I'm not the type that says, well, it had to happen that way. I mean, it happened the way it did, but from my interactions with you before this conversation and now, you're a deeply analytical person. I can't imagine that you wouldn't have felt compelled to see the world experts on MdDS before being like, okay, maybe I'll try this neural circuit stuff. I feel like that would have been nagging at you in your head. Even if you had found the neural circuit stuff a lot earlier, you would have still wondered, wait, maybe I should have done that treatment. Maybe that was the answer or what have you. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. I have all the traits of someone who is destined for this sort of condition, which sort of leads nicely to this next part of the conversation.
Please. Yes. So, I interrupted you.
No, that you're absolutely right. And I remember clear as day, I went to Spotify, found the episode with Joella, and I was on a walk and I listened to your interview. And she was the second person whose story I'd heard about MdDS besides my neurologist, Dr. Chang. And I remember just walking through the park, listening to her talk about not only that she dealt with this, but that she is better and that she did treatments that worked and she's fully healed. And up to this point, I dealt with so many demoralizing diagnoses. Like online, it would say 90% of cases of MdDS are in women, and most of them are found in women over 40. So I'm like, but I'm a guy who's 29. So does that mean I'm that much more damaged and broken that this would happen to me?
Right.
And just knowing that it could be cured even for someone who had it for a long period of time, the longer that it went, that demoralizing nature of the diagnosis really wore on me. And hearing someone say, not only was it chronic, but I'm okay. I was just crying on the walk, just so optimistic again. And I remember she listed the types of treatments that she had done, like pain reprocessing therapy, EMDR, internal family systems work. And I just said, that's my open door.
Those are on the menu now.
Yep. So,
It may not have been. When did I interview Ben? Did you ever hear Ben's story?
I didn't.
OMG. Okay. Just put, I'm glad I name dropped Ben.
I'll save it for later.
Yeah, you should check. Oh my gosh. Talk about his MdDS young man. Yeah. So in his 20s. Anyone else who's listening, if Alex is this story for you, if you are listening to Alex because you are also dealing with MdDS or PPPD and you're trying to get yourself into the mindset of hope that you need to keep moving forward, please also listen to Ben's success story. Yeah. Also just as impactful as Joella's, and I'll put them in the podcast and video description so people can just click on the links. Definitely.
We'll check that out after. And I credit your interview with Joella as being the instigator for getting my life to the place that it's at now. So to talk about kind of the treatments that I started doing right after this, I found Lauren Garshaw, who was previously with Better Mind Center. Currently, she's independent.
Yes.
She is wonderful, and she still is my pain reprocessing therapist, and she got me uh, kind of reading The Way Out by Alan Gordon in tandem. I remember reading through that checklist and being like, people pleaser, conscientious, overly conscientious, anxiety, perfectionist. And I just remember reading those and just feeling like, this is what I have for sure. And the confidence that I had in that was so strong that I really felt like I'm going to turn this around. So I found Lauren Garshaw, who's my PRT. I found Alex Bailey, who's also, he's based in San Diego, but he's my EMDR and IFS therapist. And both of them have been so instrumental in my recovery process. And I credit both of them so much, as well as you and your work and everything. And I would say Buddhism and Buddhist books have been like, those things have gotten me in the last year, because I started doing this treatments in December of 23. All of the things that I just mentioned have gotten me to a level where I fluctuate between like a 0 to a 1 or 2 to like a 1 or 2 on the resilience scale. So
yes.
Yeah.
For those of you just listening, I'm pumping my fists. It was a very, very strong gesture I just made. That is so awesome. Yes. Okay. We're going to come back to that, because I want you to celebrate your wins. And I know you've got some really cool stuff that you're doing now with it. But before we do that, can we spend a little bit of time with you explaining some of the things that you're working on or you've worked on? Because people hear me talk about seeing a therapist or doing emotional work. I've learned to hate that word so much, that term, because it's so nebulous. Like, what the heck does that even mean, emotional work? So could you maybe, as many specifics as you feel comfortable sharing, do you want to give specifics on some of the work that you've done with these two therapists that you think have really helped your nervous system say, hey, I'm good, I'm not in danger anymore?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to mention, even prior to that, was that during that whole period of time that I was doing the physical treatments, I also was seeing other therapists. So I was doing normal talk therapy. I was also doing cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And I really liked my doctor for that, Jesse Spiegel. Great doctor for sleep issues. The first part of the emotional work that I think was essential was that I had a conversation with my therapist. And while I was word vomiting when I was anxious and depressed, I realized that the part of the root of my issues in life was self-loathing. I grew up in a very high achieving family, and there was a lot of, we had everything that we needed. All the resources were there, but I did feel a tremendous amount of pressure to succeed in my accomplishments and what I was able to achieve. And I had a very, very extremely bright younger brother who did a lot of the same activities as me. And I often felt like the dumb person in my family. My parents went to a combined, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, Cornell, Stanford, and my brother went to Yale. And I felt like I was the dumb person in the family. And and to go to the IFS part, like a part of myself that formed was this inner critic, which was essentially me being just a total bad person to myself. So mean, but it was in the service of trying to make me do better in school so that I would advance my life and get more appreciation and love from my parents and all that kind of stuff. So I'm
going to pause you here for just a second, because I just want to say thank you for normalizing what you just did, because I talk a lot on my channel about trauma, and I am certainly not meaning to imply that trauma isn't a huge problem for a lot of people with neural circuit symptoms. But then sometimes people hear me talk about that stuff and they're like, I had a great life. I had amazing parents. I had an amazing family, like nothing to see here. And that is just not true. That's just not true. Even when you've had a very loving family, even when you've had your financial and security needs taken care of, right? There we so often develop the kinds of strategies that you talk about that lead to this constant sense of, again, just danger inside ourselves. Like having a critic basically yapping at you all day long, being a complete jerk to you, no matter what you did. There's no, and then imagine throwing symptoms on top of that. I can't even imagine the shame and the guilt you must have felt, and the like, just it would have added so much fuel to that fire. So thank you for normalizing that, because
Of course.
that's really important for people to hear.
Yeah, and to add to that kind of trauma conversation that you were talking about, my grandmother is a Holocaust survivor, and she and her parents were in Poland during the war, and they were Schindler's survivors. My grandma's the youngest living person on Schindler's List. So to understand what she went through, watching the movie is a good. It's not as bad as it really was in real life, but it's a good it was kind of an indicator of what that could be. And my grandmother never talked about her experiences until the movie came out, so she spent 50 years just not dealing with and not fully processing her trauma. And
Wow.
I think inevitably that is going to like come through the family to some extent too. I mean, a lot of members of my family are anxious, myself very much included. And I think that those, even if you have everything, and even if everybody has like the best of intentions, you can't control the circumstances that happen in your life that lead you to where you are, even if you want and love. And then again, I do have a very loving family, but I think inevitably some of that stress and anxiety is going to be passed down because of the
Absolutely.
circumstances dealt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's borne out in science nowadays, folks. I mean, like there's some
Body keeps the
really,
score.
yeah, well, and more, I mean, there's more and more like epigenetic research just showing, again, um this is research outside of the psychology or psychiatry world that basically just shows the way our genes, so we all have genes, obviously, that kind of are the set of programs that our body then runs. Those programs can be turned on or off depending on our external circumstances. So when someone is exposed to very extreme stress or trauma, their body has different programs turned on than if they didn't go through extreme stress and trauma. And those differences can be passed down genetically. So
Yeah,
we can genetically pass down some of the traumas people experience.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh boy, I could probably have an entire conversation with you just asking you questions about how you worked on that in therapy. But
Yeah.
I mean, so okay, so but let me back us up for just a minute, because you were talking about the inner critic. So how so that was one thing you identified. Were there other things, or was the primary work you were doing just starting to treat yourself better? Give us a sense of that.
A lot of my work was starting to treat myself better. So doing daily affirmations, doing kind of cognitive behavioral therapy on
Hmm.
this self-loathing that I'm deserving of love for myself. And I think that's my biggest takeaway from the experience would be being kind to yourself throughout this process. I think whether you deal with self-loathing in your life or not, it's always better to be kinder to yourself, and particularly
Totally.
when you're having a difficult time. In terms of other emotional work that I had to do, a lot of my EMDR work was kind of reprocessing traumatic medical experiences, and also even tracing back to like stuff that happened earlier in my life. And that, like doing the kind of eye tracking, this kind of stuff, like it was activating my parasympathetic nervous system. I was yawning like crazy. That really helped. And I think the biggest thing from the pain reprocessing standpoint, working with Lauren, was being able to just observe my condition as it was and not as an ideal. We know when we're dealing with dizziness and we're dealing with other mind body symptoms that where we're at is not the best it can be. But in order to get to the best it can be, you have to observe it and just see the symptoms for what they are. And if For some people, this might work. For some people, it might not. But at that time, it didn't really. But seeing what your symptoms are telling you, like what are they trying to teach you? And when you're miserable and not feeling good, you may not be in the mood to say, I don't care what the symptoms are telling me. And my symptoms are telling me that they hate me. So I get that that may not be the best, but it for some people it can. If you're open to listening to what your body is trying to teach you, really unlocking the fact that observing that, I think, to go back to what you were saying, noticing that we feel before we think. So oftentimes we feel a sensation and that leads to an anxious thought. So being able to observe this black energy in my solar plexus, this tightness that usually precedes an anxious thought, and being able to find ways to destabilize that, and through breath work, through non-sleep deep rest, yoga nidra, stuff like that, doing somatic tracking, all of those modalities really helped me observe the physical sensation that would lead to the anxious thought or lead to the symptom. And doing that kind of stuff definitely was able to gradually, with spikes along the way, bring the dizziness down.
Amazing. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Because ultimately, especially when you're dealing with MdDS type symptoms and they're all the time, your constant reaction to them, even if it's no longer a fear reaction, even if it's more of a just, I hate this reaction, that's in a way that's feeding them in a way. And it's just like you said, it's very understandable why you would not like them. They are physically uncomfortable. So we're saying this without any blame. We're just saying, if you want your brain to learn that it can turn the symptoms down, you have to practice reacting to them differently. And as you also said, it's not always a conscious, like thought-based reaction. You have to start working on how you notice yourself responding to them emotionally. And that's where some of that emotional work, the working with the inner critic, ties in, because if you're constantly criticizing yourself, then you have this extra layer of pain and suffering on top of the pain and suffering from the symptoms themselves. So right. I'm wondering, because I'd want to make sure we also get to the amazing stuff you're doing nowadays. Could you give us a sense of what a daily schedule was like during the recovery process? People always ask me this, like, what were you doing on these days over the last year as you've been getting better?
Well, part of the approach that you taught about in your work that stuck with me was being a B- student. So I was growing up, I was a aspiring A student who was more like an A-, B+ student, right? Mm-hmm. So I was always trying to do more and trying to be on the edge of like, I'm putting all my attention into this. And while I was recovering in the first year and a half, I was trying to be an A+ student. And that's probably part of what contributed to it not getting better enough, was that I was too focused on this and not living my life. So the last year, starting the different the psychological treatments, was trying to not to make my life normal again, and finding moments in the margins to learn about ways that I can do better, obviously doing therapy on a weekly basis, those kinds of things. So my schedule was trying to work again. So I'm a musician. So doing like writing music, working with other clients doing music. I was also doing work, still am doing work for a PR firm, doing brand deals and business development. So doing those things, keeping my mind occupied by normal life. And that is another thing that is, if you're recovering right now, you're listening to this, know that you're okay. And by just accepting that you're okay and living your life more normally, that is a huge part of the process of getting better.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So what I imagine then is you're kind of re-engaging with life in a way that feels meaningful to you. You're spending a lot less time thinking about symptoms. You're spending a lot less time kind of obsessing about them and ruminating about them. And then maybe you've started a meditation practice, and then maybe at some points during the day, you might be practicing somatic tracking where you're kind of
Yes,
noticing the sensations and kind of letting them be or observing the feelings in your body. And then also doing kind of more intensive trauma related and emotional related work with a therapist once or twice a week.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I'd be doing early on, especially when I just found out about it. Of course, I got overly excited and was doing
of
a
course.
lot of somatic tracking.
Of course.
And then eventually I realized like that's sort of defeating the purpose of it too. But
Sure.
I would try to go on a walk every day and just observe my steps, really feel it. I think I also found a lot of coping behaviors that would work for me. So like walking on grass, golf was honestly great for me because I would
Yeah.
walk, I'd be outside. Anytime that I was in an enclosed space, my symptoms would be worse. So
Yes.
being outside in nature, problem solving, again, using my over analytical brain to focus on a real life problem to solve rather than focusing on how to solve my dizziness
Yes.
was really great for me. And chess was the same thing. I feel like golf and chess during that time I got really into, and those are activities that I could use. I could sort of activate my intellectual mind on something that wasn't solving the dizziness problem.
Yeah. This
So
is
I'd be,
gold,
yeah,
Alex, what you're saying right now.
yeah. So I would be doing somatic tracking. In the last 3 months or so, I started doing transcendental meditation, so mantra-based meditation. I had done about 5 or 6 years worth of meditation several years ago, kind of stopped for a while. And then when my dizziness was really bad, if I did anything with my eyes closed, it was just like I was being, someone was shaking me. So I
Yeah.
didn't do meditation for a while, but the last 3 months I've been doing it and my baseline anxiety levels have just plummeted. It's amazing. And um, I really think part of this that I have to mention because I think it's too important is reading a number of Buddhist literature. Particularly recently, I've been reading Tara Brach's Radical Acceptance,
Yes. That's
which is a
it.
wonderful book. And she talks at great length about the, again, not loving a negative situation that you're in, but just sort of being okay with it. And I think Pema Chodron talks about this a lot in her books as well, with uncomfortable with uncertainty,
I've
with
got
when things fall
some
apart.
books. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I recently, in the last month, this is the thing, like, I'm certainly not an F student. I've definitely right now I'm probably like a C or a D student. As you get better, you will realize that like, wow, I'm a much worse student, but that's like the best news
Yes.
ever.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and there was a meditation that Tara Brach did in her book, and it was all about yes. It's so simple, but really what she wants you to do is essentially like closing your eyes and really feeling what your body feels like when you think of a negative situation, and when you say no, what comes up. And it's this
Yes.
tightening. And for me, it's always like I've learned now that it's like tightening in my solar plexus. It's kind of like black warm energy that stores right there. And when I say no, that's what happens. And when I think about something that's negative, I say yes. Other people use, and she also uses the phrase "this belongs" also. So whichever of those phrases works better for you, yes, or "this belongs." For me, simpler the better. And so when I experience a thought or a feeling or a sensation that I don't want, it's really hard to get good at this, but I promise you, you will get better, is saying yes or thinking yes. Whatever that version of it is, you don't have to like it. No one is asking you to be like, oh, I love you, symptoms. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. All that you have to do is to tolerate it. And the more that you accept it, the more signals that you're sending to your brain that everything's fine and that
Yes.
you will be fine. Even if you're not fine right now, that eventually you will be fine. And that's the most important takeaway, is that where you're at right this second is not where you are for the rest of your life.
Exactly. Yes, for now.
Yeah.
Yes, for now. It's so interesting that you hit on this because I have a video coming soon about what stops people from recovering. And number 9, it's memorable because it's exactly this point. one of the things that stops people from recovering is they just cannot accept where they are right now. And I'm not asking people, oh, you need to accept this as your life now. That's not at all. But moment to moment, you fighting and refusing to accept the sensation the way that it is right now. And I'm not saying we are not saying that it isn't the hardest possible thing that we could possibly ask you to do. It is. This is the hardest thing we can ask you to do. But when you're able to do that, you break the cycle. You break this feedback cycle that tells your brain this is a very terrible thing and it needs to keep drawing your attention to it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Excellent advice.
And even if you
Excellent
don't
advice.
think that you're capable of that, this is a sort of interesting exercise that works for different situations. If you're the kind of person that, let's say there's somebody that you really want to talk to, that maybe someone you're interested in, or someone that you're like need to talk to, like career-wise, networking or something. I remember, I think it was maybe in business school, somebody was like, oh, I don't think that I can go up to them. I feel too nervous. And I feel like one of my teachers said, well, just pretend like you're a person that is that way. Act
Yes.
like it.
Just act like it.
Just hack your own brain in a sense and be like, well, I'm not the kind of person that can accept my symptoms. I know that that thought exists because I was there too. But I think I told myself at some point, like, well, let's pretend like I'm someone who can accept it. I'm going to pretend like I'm someone else right now. And I think destabilizing your symptoms. One thing I wanted to mention as well, there was like a curable worksheet or something that had to do with symptoms. And I remember I named my dizziness Fluffy Bananas because it was cute. One of my last name is Biniaz Harris, and a nickname that I got was Bananas because somebody thought that was how my name was pronounced. And so I felt like Fluffy Bananas was an appropriate name because it was kind of silly and it also was me. And I think like attaching the fact that my symptoms are me, there's something that's kind of freeing about the idea that, and I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but I think when I realized that my symptoms were created by my personality, by my experiences, by my life, it made me realize that I am the one who's going to get myself out of it. And there was a lot of power knowing that. And I think back to the prior part about our conversation where you kind of talked about how we felt powerless in a traumatic situation, like being in a fire. I felt so much agency knowing that my personality, and I am the reason that I got into this situation. And so I am going to be the reason that I get out of it. That was tough to accept initially, but freeing. And it also gave me so much power.
That's right. That's right. Yes. That is it right there. Also just more gold. When people see the symptoms as like this alien enemy, it's so hard to get to the point where you can actually see it as an empowering thing that you might need to do work to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, gosh, the last 15 minutes, you have dropped some serious gold. I'm super excited. I feel like I should make like a series of clips out of this video, like this, and this. This is it right here.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, this is awesome. But I want to make sure we don't skip probably one of the most delightful parts of this conversation. I'd really like you to be able to share what you're working on right now, because it sounds so exciting.
Yeah. So currently I am finishing up an EP that is all about my chronic dizziness journey. So obviously when life gives you, I've always felt that, and when you complain that your favorite bands, like you like their early stuff, but you don't like the new stuff, it's because they were poor and starving and they were traumatized and they had their whole life that they were writing about that wasn't great. And now that they've gotten rich and successful, what negative things do they have to write about? So certainly when this health journey was going on in the peak of it, I didn't have any creative well of inspiration at all. But as I started to improve, I was able to write more and more music, and I felt it was necessary for me cathartically to write music about my experience. So I will be dropping music starting in February for the next several months. Each song is based on a part of my recovery. So the first piece is about the ocean, about the waves that I was on and sort of that feeling. And honestly, it's really not negative quite yet, because even though it was a scary experience for me, it's more just like what the ocean feels like. And then it's about the imbalance that I felt. And then there will be a piece about my depression and being stuck in negative feedback loops. And then I have a piece that's about when my grandpa passed away. And I wrote a piece that was dedicated to his memory. And, you know, he died sort of when my symptoms were at their worst. And so that was a really pivotal point for me as well. And then finally about my acceptance of my symptoms. And
but not acceptance like, oh, it's just going to be a 7 out of 8 forever, but more like, I need to have a different relationship with them if I actually want them to go down. I just want to be clear, because people are like, what do you mean acceptance? I can't accept this. No, but we're not asking you to accept this as your forever. We're asking for you to practice accepting that this is what it is and it's coming from inside you right now. That's all.
Absolutely. That's definitely the acceptance that I meant, because I am so stubborn that I would never have accepted that this was going to be my life moving forward. That I listened to Nicole's recovery video with you, and stubbornness is actually a very good trait to be able to recover, because you will not accept the nature of where your life is, but what you can do is accept where it is right this second.
Yes.
In pursuit of better times ahead, which for everyone listening, if you're currently dealing with chronic dizziness and other mind-body symptoms, or really any chronic condition, or will deal with some health condition in the future, you're not alone, and you're loved, hopefully by yourself, but also by others. And like, we're all in this together.
Yes. Yes. Well said. So I cannot wait to hear some of your music. So where can people find your music? Because people are going to be really into this, because you're reflecting so many of their experiences.
Yeah. My artist name is Alex BH, and I'm on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, wherever you listen to music. And I really feel inspired from my experience to share what it's like living with a chronic condition, with a chronic mind body, chronic dizziness, you know, my life living with those things. And I feel like what better way to use what I'm best at and what I enjoy doing the most to try to share my experiences. And if it connects with one person, or if I can help one person feel less alone with what I make, then it's worth it.
Awesome. So I fully expect you then, when they start to drop, maybe you can send them my way and I can put them up on my social media and make them easy for people to find. That'd be awesome. I would love to share. And it's interesting too, because we have another community graduate who's also a musician, who's, I'm sure hopefully he's not watching these interviews anymore because he's off living his life, but I'll have to connect the two of you. He's a singer, and also I know he was interested in making some music about his experience too. MdDS as well. For him, I think it was after a cruise, but I'll get the two of you in touch.
I would love to. I would love that. Yeah. And I just wanted to say before we kind of wrap things up, just like how indebted and grateful I am to you and the work that you do. I wouldn't be where I'm at if not for hearing that conversation with Joella. It really changed my life. And I was at a point where I felt like the symptoms that I was experiencing in my life was at times not worth living. And also that there was nothing good that came out of it. And now that I've improved so much, I think I can say, because of the work that you've done, that I've learned so much about myself. And I'm finally at a place where I can say, although maybe it's not the best thing that's ever happened to me, that this has been a very powerful experience dealing with a chronic condition. I've become a more empathetic person. I've become a more kind person, both to myself and to other people. I've become more aware of other people's suffering and more engaged as a human being. And I thank you so much for like helping me get to a point where I could view my suffering as a teaching rather than as just a terrible life.
Mm. You are so, so welcome for whatever contribution I had to that. And that is why I'm so glad you're willing to have this conversation with me. Of all the things that I do, I've said this before, I'll say it again. The success stories are the most important and most impactful thing that I do, because you remember Googling this stuff beforehand. Like there were no success stories, and now they're there for people who are looking for them. They're out there, and you're a person who's clearly demonstrating that even if you've had it for longer than that arbitrary year mark, because by the way, that is totally not based on anything other than someone's random decision.
It's anecdotal.
It's totally
it
anecdotal.
Can't be based on. It can't be based.
It's not based on science. Yeah, it's not based on fact. But you are demonstrating with this conversation that it is completely possible. I said this in a different video recently, but I'll say it here too. Your day one is the day you realize that you have a neural circuit issue. So if that's 20 years after your symptoms started or 2 months after your symptoms started, your day one is today. If you realize today that you have a neural circuit dizziness issue. So from there, it's in your hands. But
absolutely, I agree with that. I agree with that because, you know, I look at the saga that I've been through and I say, wow, it's been almost 2.5 years. It's amazing that I've been through so much in those 2.5 years. But really, like you said, day one of the new part of my recovery is just over a year ago. And there have been dips, there have been setbacks. And I think anytime that I would experience a setback, I would find some of your YouTube videos. And I think one thing that always stuck with me was that your recovery isn't feeling better. Your recovery is not feeling good. It's about not caving to fear when you're not feeling good. So the only way to recover is it has to involve not feeling good, because and hopefully that window is very short and you don't deal with it for a long time. But what I learned to accept, again, this isn't like loving it, but seeing a spike in symptoms as an opportunity to tighten that window of fear and tighten that window of symptoms. That is the recovery. It's not that you're going to find the neural circuit dizziness guidebook and then you're immediately going to feel good, or that even feeling good is something to strive for. This goes back to the Buddhism stuff, which is that we often seek out what feels good and we avoid what feels bad. And I totally get when you're in the peak of this, because I've been there, that you don't want to accept and don't want to live in this state of panic, of fear, of imbalance. But the way to improve is to see that and say, this is my quest. This will be the hardest thing that I've ever done. And accepting my dizziness was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it will work. I promise.
Mic drop. I have nothing to add. Listen to what Alex just said. Rewind if you need to. Alex, it was a pleasure. And honestly, I could talk to you for another 3 hours. I feel like you could just keep dropping these truth bombs and I would just be like, that, and that too. Thank you again so much for your time and for agreeing to do this. And again, please keep me posted on when your music drops. And all of you, thank you so much for listening, for tuning in. Please let us know if you have questions or comments. You can drop them below. You can also give this video a like, share it, or subscribe to my channel. These things help me reach more people. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, you can head over to YouTube if you want to join the conversation. That's always nice. But you can also follow the podcast, give us a 5-star rating. All of those things also help me reach more people. Okay. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Alex. And we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.